I'm Rae Powers. I am in a partner position with the Xerces Society and the Natural Resources Conservation Services, or NRCS, and I am working in the Central Great Plains region in Nebraska and South Dakota.
Hi, I'm Dee Dee Soto. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist and NRCS partner biologist based out of the Central Valley of California.
Hi, my name is Kaylee Wheeler, and I'm a range field specialist with South Dakota State University Extension.
So today we are going to be focusing on rangeland wildflowers and the resources that they provide to both livestock and pollinators. If you don't know the Xerces Society, we are a nonprofit organization that focuses on invertebrates, like pollinators and other invertebrates in their habitat. And we are a member organization, so we would love to have you as a member if you are so moved. It's how we get our work done, and we really appreciate all of our members. All right, so today we are talking about rangelands across the US. And at the Xerces Society, we know that rangelands are really critically important for pollinators. They are providing floral resources, which are food for many of our pollinators. They're providing safe, undisturbed nesting and overwintering sites, things like bare ground and leaving some plant material over the winter that they can nest in. They're providing larval host plants, and they're just really critical for a lot of different species of wildlife, in addition to providing a lot of really critical, important ecosystem services. And we really view ranchers as conservation partners in our work because we know when ranchers are not supported, that rangeland can get easily converted to things like row crop, or it can be disrupted by things like natural gas development or urban development. So we really, really value those partners on the ground. And when we're thinking about pollinators on rangelands, a lot of times we're thinking a lot about wildflowers. And sometimes wildflowers can get a little bit of a bad rap in the ranching community. Not everywhere, not every rancher, but in some places they can be seen as competition for grasses, using up the water resources or soil resources and space that otherwise grass would inhabit. They can be viewed as noxious weeds mistakenly. They can be thought of as, all of them are toxic to livestock. And a small percentage of our native wildflowers are toxic to livestock, but it is a pretty small percentage and is pretty geographically unique in some places. So we really want to communicate the value of these wildflowers to ranchers, to land managers that are managing these places to show them what they really can provide. Because when we don't, we know that broadcast aerial applications of broadleaf herbicides happen, right? If we're not valuing these plants, if we view them as a waste of space, ranchers and other land managers will pay money to have them eliminated in the hopes that, they're going to be getting more valuable forage in that place. And that really relies on a couple of assumptions. One, that the money spent on those applications, on that herbicide, is going to result in increased grass forage, and that is going to lead to livestock gain. And we've got some research disputing that in Oklahoma. It's about a 5-year period that they looked at herbicide treated versus non-treated pastures. And they didn't see significant differences in livestock gain, and in fact found that grass biomass is much more dependent on rainfall than it is on the plant community surrounding it. And it's also this assumption that wildflowers are not forage, that cattle are not eating wildflowers, and that they're not useful in the landscape. There's a fair amount of literature through time about the role that wildflowers play in livestock diets, and it's pretty variable through time and space and management and livestock species or class. But it can be anywhere from 20 to 45% of cattle diets throughout the year. And some recent research from Kevin Sedovic out of North Dakota he's seeing about 25% utilization of forbs and shrubs throughout the summer. And that was across several different management types. So we know they're eating them. So we decided to go out and collect some wildflowers and look at their nutrition and macro and micro minerals for livestock. So kind of the first step of that project was to identify which wildflowers. And we wanted things that were really common and abundant, something that, the average rancher could identify or, knew about. Because we're focused on invertebrates and wildlife, we wanted things that were valuable to pollinators. And we wanted things that, at least anecdotally, we thought were palatable to cattle. And so we pulled together these lists, and it really came from a wide variety of resources. We reached out to experts across the regions that we're working in. We leaned on our own personal experience, and we also ground truth those species lists with NRI data. And starting in 2021 and up through this past summer, we've been collecting samples from about 11 states. Across 11 states, I think we have about 75 species. Although, as Dee Dee will tell you about next, she's got some new ones this year, so it's more than that now. And excuse me, we've got over 1,000 samples, and these are across kind of the growth stage of different species, anywhere from vegetative to seed set. In some regions, we did make a concerted effort to get growth stages of, a certain subset of species. We wanted to have vegetative, pre-bloom, bloom, and seed set, but it's highly variable across the data set. So here's just a snapshot of our sampling effort geographically. And here is the lab analysis that we ran. So we are looking at a pretty normal forage content analysis here. We're looking at crude protein, and the other one that I'm going to talk about today is total digestible nutrients, or TDN. And then we looked at a suite of about 14 macro and micro minerals that are important for livestock community, reproduction, growth, all the things. And here's what we found. So of those 75 species, and you don't need to take in any of those common names there on the left side of the graph. Just know that they're there. Those are all the species that we sampled. And we're looking at their mean crude protein percentage after running that analysis. The red line is the minimum requirement for a 1,200-pound lactating cow, which is about 9.8% crude protein. And then those bars are colored with some measures of hay that we typically look at for crude protein. So the green is a pretty high quality legume hay, yellow would be a standard native grass hay, and the gray is a poor quality hay. And what we found is that about 75% of those 75 species are meeting that minimum requirement for crude protein. And the protein levels of most of our wildflowers are in line with or above those of native grass species. This was somewhat unsurprising for some species. We've known that legumes are likely pretty high in crude protein, and they're one that is often cited by ranchers as something that is valuable and that their cows will eat. So what we're looking at here again is crude protein, and I've just pulled out a few of the legume species that we sampled. The black dots and lines are the Forbs samples and their crude protein across their growth stages. The blue and red are a cool season and a warm season, both native grasses, little blue stem and needle and thread. That data is coming out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln from Mitch Stevenson. So what we see is, these legumes are often higher in crude protein than our grasses through time, especially later in the season. However, we were surprised by some of these results. Milkweeds are one species that often get a bad rap with ranchers. There are lots of different species of milkweeds, and some of them do contain toxic levels of cardenolides or secondary compounds. But especially in the northern and central Great Plains, our milkweed species don't have toxic levels of those secondary compounds, and we're finding that they are in fact a highly prized forage for some forms of livestock. Seeing these results of crude protein for things like common milkweed and showy milkweed was a really nice validation of some other current research coming out in the region. We also got an example here from California with the Mexican world milkweed, again showing that high crude protein level. When we try and look at total digestible nutrients, which is a measure of the energy content in that forage, these plants are looking even more desirable. About 93% 98% of the species that we sampled were above that minimum requirement for total digestible nutrients. And they're often outperforming grasses through time on pasture. So this graph is a little bit different, but it does tell a cool story, so I like to include it. So we're looking at the total digestible nutrients, but instead of growth stage, we're looking at actually the sampling dates through time. So from May 10th to about September 20th. And we've again got those grass values for the total digestible nutrients. The cloud of dots in the background is our entire Forb data set. So all of our species in that data set are shown here. And what I really love about this graph is it just shows you the value of these wildflowers. You know, they may not be a huge component of the plant community. They're certainly not the main biomass that are out on these landscapes. But by keeping those and valuing these plant species, you're giving cattle something that is pretty high quality to eat through that entire time period, which I think is really a great message and showing that they really do provide that value. The other component of this data set were those macro and micro minerals. And that data set is a lot more complicated, right? So we've got 14 measures there, and mineral content is influenced by soil factors. So, you know, the locations of sampling do influence the levels of different macro and micro minerals we're seeing in these plants. In general, the message here is they are providing high levels of minerals, of those key minerals that livestock need. And I'll just show you a few of the mineral species, a few of the minerals that we looked at in a few species. So here we're looking at copper content, which is something we're pretty depauperate in the central and northern Great Plains. So it's always nice to get some extra copper. The dotted line is going to be that minimum requirement. You can see our warm and cool season grasses pretty much zero copper content. Very little copper can be found in our native grass communities. So some of our wildflower species are providing that minimum copper requirement. But even if they're not above that minimum line, they are providing more copper than the rest of the grasses surrounding them. Phosphorus is another one that we like to look at, and it's important for livestock health. And again, we're seeing that many of these wildflowers are above minimum requirement and usually in line with or above that native grass content. And in addition to those, calcium, potassium, and magnesium levels in wildflowers were often higher than the minimum requirement, and almost always in line with or higher than our native grass communities. Our wildflowers are also often providing higher levels of zinc than our grasses. So, you know, I think the main takeaways from this data set, from this project, are really that, you know, plant diversity is the critical outcome of land management. And if we are allowing those wildflowers to thrive in these spaces, we're really allowing our livestock more opportunities to meet their nutritional and mineral needs. And we love that here at Xerces Society because we know that having those diverse wildflowers on the landscape really allows our pollinators to thrive in these places as well. This information, we're going to be having regional guides out that'll probably be early 2025 as opposed to late 2024. Next year, we'll really focus on getting this data set out in a peer-reviewed publication. Kaylee will talk about her work with the South Dakota Grazing Land Coalition, Grassland Coalition, sorry, and SDSU. And, you know, just moving this work forward in different regions and more intensely with universities and other organizations. Any project, you know, we've got more questions when we ended than when we started. So really nailing down more aspects of the livestock use, you know, how management impacts their use of these plants or even the levels of minerals in these plants, how soil and moisture impact their levels, climate, looking at other classes of livestock, some really great questions about winter forage quality, and then really exploring some of those secondary compounds that might be discouraging herbivory. This work was not done in isolation. We had lots of collaborators, including NRCS was a big funder, both in North Dakota and across the region. And this wouldn't have been possible without a huge number of folks helping us do field collections across the region. So just huge thanks to all of those folks. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Dee Dee to talk about her collections in California.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dee Dee Soto. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist and NRCS partner biologist with the Xerces Society, and I am based out of the Central Valley of California in Merced, California. So today I just wanted to talk about a little bit about some Forb sampling that we did here in California, and all of this is to try and add value to the study that Rae just talked about. So essentially followed the guidelines that were already developed by Rae and everybody else that collaborated on this project. But I just want to start off a little bit first with some background on California rangelands and kind of paint the picture of why this work is so important here in California. So according to UCANR, we have about 62.9 million acres of rangelands in the state of California, and approximately 40 million of those acres are grazed. And about 17.9 million of those acres are privately owned. And 62.9 million acres is quite a vast chunk of land. And California is very diverse. We're actually a biodiversity hotspot. We're one of the few places around the world with a Mediterranean climate. And we also have really unique geography throughout the state, which creates incredible plant diversity. So if you look at the map on the right here, this is a map of the floristic provinces within the state of California. And you see a lot of different shades of colors representing different plant communities in different floristic regions. So overall, there are three larger provinces. And these include the California Floristic Province, which is the largest. We also have a little bit of Great Basin and desert floristic provinces. And with all of the diverse climate, geography, and geology within the state, we have nearly 7,000 different native species, subspecies, and varieties of native plants within the state of California. And many of these species are endemic and found nowhere else in the world. And there's also a lot of rare species that are found within California as well. And I think there's still a lot that we don't know about these plants. I kind of tried to reach out to folks here in California and sort of learn some of the same things that Rae was asking folks, in the Great Plains. And I wasn't really able to find a lot of information on nutrients or like what plants livestock like to consume that are California native forbs. So there's definitely a lot of data gaps out there. Um, and just to point out, we have nearly 7,000 different species of plants here in California, and I think you can imagine that with that comes a really high diversity of pollinators within our state. And considering that more than 85% of flowering plants require an animal and usually an insect to pollinate them, rangelands really serve a critical role in maintaining that diversity, both plant and, well, fauna and flora here in the state of California. Um, and, there's a lot of places around the state that really harbor or refuge and provide excellent habitat for a lot of our pollinators. And California alone has over 1,600 different native bee species. Pinnacles National Park has almost 400 different bee species just within the park boundary. And Pinnacles is a place that's surrounded by rangelands. So, these places are really critical habitat for both pollinators, for plants, and for livestock. We also have about 260 different butterfly species and 4,500 moth species, many of which are declining. We definitely have some major land management and changes within the state, urbanization and change of rangelands to intensive crop agriculture is a pretty big issue here in California. And with a growing population, we only can expect that that's just going to continue to happen. So again, it's really critical to protect rangelands and protect these habitats for a lot of this wildlife. And we tend to focus on butterflies and bees because they're a little bit more charismatic, but there's a lot of other insect pollinators within the state, including beetles and flies and wasps, and we also have vertebrate pollinators and other wildlife to think about. Um, so that's just to give you an idea of the diversity that is within California and within California rangelands. And so now I'll talk a little bit about the plant selection and sampling that we did here. So luckily, Rae and the rest of the team, took on the heavy lift of organizing this and developing sampling methods and all of that. And I kind of came in and just was collecting what I could, basically. And so there was a little bit of extra funding, and they told me to go out and collect plant species here in California. So I utilized a number of resources. I utilized plant lists that we had developed already at Xerces for critical pollinator plant species within California. I also reached out to NRCS range specialists and staff from the Plant Materials Center. And I talked to some of the ranchers that I work with. I also focused on some of the common and abundant species on rangelands. And I was lucky enough to utilize the plant lists that were developed by the Great Plains team for this exact study. So I was trying to focus on some of the similar genera that they selected as, some of those important plant species for livestock and that might have some anecdotal use by livestock. Um, so I did a lot of opportunistic sampling too. I collected similar genera, just different species of some of the plants that were highlighted. And I also sampled in rangelands and then some adjacent natural non-grazed areas. Um, just because I was seeing, some species are within the rangelands and some are not. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of have plants from both sides and maybe try and make some conclude or come to some conclusion of why we see them outside of the rangelands and not within. So hopefully just to get a little bit more information out of that. So this year, it was just me sampling. So this year I collected over 25 different species. That's over 75 samples here in California. We're waiting for analysis and also considering maybe doing some selenium testing, just because it's possible that selenium hyperaccumulates in some of these plants and could be a potential problem. So it would be nice to know or have that information. And also wanted to touch on a little bit of the challenges of this season and collecting. It's just been me collecting these samples, so there's some gaps in phenological stages. Sometimes I wasn't able to go out and collect every single phenological stage that we needed for each species. And some of the reasons for that were, not enough people power, and also there were wildfires that prevented access to some of these areas. And yeah, just capacity at times. So there's still more to sample, more to do. Ideally, we would like to complete these sets and have all of the samples, all of the phenological stages for each of the species. But here on this table, you can see, this isn't all of the species that I sampled, but just to get an idea of some of them. Um, we had some lupins, some clovers, milkweeds, um, also some geophytes in there. So kind of a range of things. And I'm really excited to know what kind of nutrient composition these plants have. Um, particularly because some of them are also, used as food or were traditional foods too. So I'm curious about that. And then I just wanted to touch on why this work is so important for California. As I mentioned, rangelands are critical for plant and wildlife diversity, and this study is going to help fill a lot of knowledge gaps. To me, I think it's really important to inform better grazing and management practices. I know just from sampling, there's some sites that are a lot more diverse and have a lot more cover on the ground and are grazed a lot differently. And then there's some that are grazed really hard. And so, it'd be nice to be able to make better management decisions based off of how to maintain plant communities, native plant communities within the state. Um, and I think it could also provide a lot of information for restoration. Like I said, when comparing grazed and ungrazed sites, potentially we could see what species get grazed out and which ones don't. And also how to either reincorporate species diversity into the plant composition within a plant community. Um, I think it also, maybe this is unique to California, I'm not sure, but I think it also provides information for non-rangeland grazing in California. I think there's a bigger push for grazing within sort of ag lands. And ideally, I think, when they're grazing on those sites, they're grazing cover crops that are usually non-native species. But if we could make better restoration and management decisions there, maybe potentially we could also inform which native species to utilize in those situations. And I think another really big one too is, there's a lot more push for grazing to control fuels for wildfire here in the state. And I think that, this could also help inform how do we do appropriate grazing within these areas that maybe typically aren't regularly grazed because they're not working lands, but they do have high fuels, which is concerning. So, yeah, I think those are some of the things that I would be curious to learn from this and definitely promote native biodiversity and conservation since we see so many things in decline. And, I think we really need to step up and really take care of our native plant and animal diversity here in the state and everywhere. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kaylee. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kaylee Wheeler, and I'm a range field specialist with South Dakota State University Extension. My connection with Rae and Dee Dee and the Xerces Society is that I had the opportunity to lead the efforts of the South Dakota version of this native wildflower sampling project. Rae and Dee Dee did an excellent job talking about how their work with the wildflower sampling got started with the Xerces Society, but I want to talk about how we got this project off the ground in South Dakota and where we are now. So several years ago, our state's Grassland Coalition acquired an NRCS grant to help educate South Dakota land managers on the importance of plant diversity. And the deliverables of that project were to develop materials to promote smarter spraying practices and to overall just reduce the need for broadcast and aerial spraying and herbicide use. Unfortunately, several things happened, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which prevented them from completing those objectives. However, one important realization came to light during that time. And we kind of realized that how can we really tell producers the benefits of keeping those non-grass plants in their pastures without the data to help back it up. Around that time, we became aware of the work that Rae and her team at Xerces were doing to collect plants across the Great Plains. And we thought it would be a really good opportunity to help build on those efforts in South Dakota. We also wanted to have a data set that told the story of our home state. So we worked with our grant team and we pitched the idea to our producer-led board on our South Dakota Grassland Coalition to essentially spend the remaining grant funds on researching the nutritional benefits of native forbs. And luckily, what we got back was overwhelming support and enthusiasm from our producers. Aside from all of the plant diversity and pollinator arguments that Rae and Dee really broke down in their presentations, some of the direct benefits that we saw for South Dakota would be a general improvement in grazing livestock nutrition. A lot of our producers have an interest in targeted species grazing and personalized mineral and supplement programs. However, we just don't have that knowledge on the nutritional value and mineral content of those non-grass plants on the rangeland. Additionally, many people will instinctively remove forbs in their pastures via chemical or mechanical control. And this is often due to the misconception that these plants are creating competition against grass, or they are noxious weeds, or potentially toxic to our animals. And we just want the ability to offer better education on smart spraying practices. Additionally, this data is just going to be a really valuable tool for future SDSU research to be able to expand on just understanding more of that livestock foraging behavior and diving into those interactions between the animals, the plants, the soils, and the minerals that are there. So our team worked together to help identify what plants we wanted to collect, where we were going to collect them, and how we wanted to collect them. But one important piece of the planning is that we wanted our producer board of the Grassland Coalition to heavily direct the project. So we had all of our producers make priority lists of the plants that they wanted to be sampled. If you know South Dakota, you know that the state is made up of two very distinctly different landscapes on the east side and the west side of the state. So we wanted a good mix of plant species on both sides of the state. We also knew that Rae had already collected some samples from South Dakota, and we didn't want to double up and collect samples that she already had a lot of. So we all worked together to come up with that list of approximately 30 key native species to be sampled across the state. It's not very often that our producers get to be so heavily involved in a research project, so it was really cool to be able to give them a lot of say in how the project would be conducted. Also, several members of the board volunteered their time and their land to help with collections. Also, our extension leaders at South Dakota State University showed their support by matching the funds already secured by the Grassland Coalition. So we had funding support from two sources, and we also had a really great group of partner organizations to help collaborate with us in South Dakota. So we had quite a few staff from the NRCS. We also worked with people at the Nature Conservancy, the South Dakota Game Fish and Parks, Audubon Great Plains, and the South Dakota Grasslands Initiative. Everyone all joined together in the planning and execution of this project. So all told, we ended up with 1,056 samples across 10 locations in the state. Each location included 3 different sampling sites for the sake of replication and good science. We also made sure to go back to the same locations to collect those plants in 3 distinct phenological stages. So we focused on pre-bloom, blooming, and seed set. Essentially, we used the same protocol that Rae was already doing with the Xerces, because another one of our goals was to make sure that our data set matched up with the stuff that Rae and her team were already doing. So Rae already showcased a nutritional overview of the species they collected and some species-specific graphs as well. Key takeaway from her was that a lot of those plants are meeting and exceeding our livestock nutrient requirements. Right now, I'm still waiting on a lot of the data to come back from the lab for our South Dakota samples. But the cool thing is that we will have all of the same feed and mineral values that the Xerces samples have, so our data is going to align very, very well. However, we did end up adding the selenium test to all of our South Dakota samples because much of the state has high selenium soils, so we just wanted to make sure to have that information as well. I'm going to take this chance to pull a few interesting results from our shrub-like species to show you all. But before I do, I wanted to take 1 second to clarify how we actually sample our shrub-like plants. We only collected the new year's growth from the plant. So in this photo of lead plant, you can see that the new growth is usually green and succulent and a lot softer compared to the woodier stems of previous year's growth. So this, again, this green new growth, which typically would be grazed by the livestock, is what we actually collected for our shrub species. So on this slide, I have the crude protein of several native shrubs found in South Dakota. On the left side, I have the crude protein requirements of a 1,200-pound lactating cow in the yellow bar to show how these plants are contributing to her diet. Cows will be in their greatest nutritional demand about 6 to 8 weeks after they calve, and that's when they reach peak lactation. So for spring calving cows, they're oftentimes reaching their greatest nutritional demands during peak vegetative growth on the rangelands. Thus, a cow in peak lactation should easily be able to meet her protein needs when these plants are present on the landscape. As you can see, a cow's peak lactation requirement is 10% crude protein. And you'll notice also that yucca appears on this graph twice because we decided to sample the yucca stalks and the yucca blooms separate from the yucca leaves. As you can see, with the exception of the yucca leaves, everything is exceeding a cow's peak requirement. Looking at this graph, you might start to think, what would the value of a yucca plant be for your cow if it's not enough to meet her requirements? Well, on this graph, I've also included the crude protein requirements of a 1,200-pound dry cow that is mid-gestation. And her requirement is only about 7% crude protein. So this scenario would be that spring calving cow in the fall and winter after her calf has been weaned and we've stopped that lactation. You'll notice that now the yucca leaf is meeting that cow's nutrient requirements. For this reason, yucca can still be a very valuable source of nutrition for fall and winter grazing. On this slide, I have the total digestible nutrients, or TDN, of the same plants. And on the left, I've included that TDN value in the yellow bar for that same 1,200-pound cow in peak lactation, which is 58%. Again, you'll notice that this tells a similar story of the crude protein. All those plants are exceeding her energy requirements aside from the yucca leaf. And again, you might be wondering, maybe you should get rid of some of that yucca to be able to make room for one of these other plants. But here again, on this graph, I've also included the TDN requirements of that same 1,200-pound cow after we've stopped her lactation with weaning. And that value is only 50%. Now you'll notice that the yucca leaf again meets that cow's nutrient requirements. So I chose to take this opportunity to show you guys some data from our shrubbier plants because they tend to get a lot of blame for being nuisances on the rangeland and our pastures, and they tend to get the blame that they're competing with grass production and taking up space. So the nutritional values of these plants show that they're still going to be very valuable for those cows, even throughout the year, even when they're really high nutrient demands at peak lactation. Another thing I want you to think about is that sometimes plant parts can be nutritionally different than other plant parts, such as in the case of yucca. And on that note, not all plants are going to be useful at the same time of year, but that's the benefit of plant diversity. In the photo on the right, you can see a yucca plant where the leaves were grazed during the winter time compared to the really high quality yucca stalk on the left that would probably be grazed during the early springtime. Another thing to think about is that cows eat a lot more than just grass. Diversity of plant species and plant types can be really beneficial nutritionally to meet all these different goals throughout the year and when you're grazing with different species. And lastly, I just want to leave you with this. Rae and Dee Dee really hit on this as well, but ultimately plant diversity is the cornerstone to a healthy landscape and healthy animals, which ultimately leads to healthy humans. So I really urge producers to think about this data. Stay tuned for all the more data that we're going to be getting in, but think of all the ways that you can promote plant diversity on your own pastures and your own ranches through your management practices. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. Here's my contact information, and we're all here to answer questions. Thank you.